Okay, everybody, thank you very much for attending this CE Hub Lunchtime webinar, Circular Economy, Natural Capital and Net Zero. We're delighted to have you here and also to have three fabulous speakers from some of the most important areas that need to be addressed if we are actually to transition to net zero. Now, by way of introduction, just a few initial slides, just to set the scene. I'm sure most of us will all be aware of the background to this being the International Scientific Consensus reported in the IPCC report, many others as well, that in order to prevent the worst climate damages and keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, then human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide need to reach net zero around 2050. Of course, we need to address the other greenhouse gases as well, and we need to do this via a huge array of approaches, not just cutting emissions, not just removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but also fundamentally changing the setup and operating guidelines for our economy. And also we need to recognise that not only do we have the challenge of hi there, I think we might possibly have a few open microphones at the moment, so if it is possible to mute just for a while, that would be really great. Thanks. As I was saying, we've got an integrated challenge here. We have greenhouse gas emissions going through the roof at the same time as biodiversity is going through the floor. And while conventional measures of progress, such as GDP, continue to grow, then we have a long-term and indeed accelerating decline in nature's capital. And that actually brings us to the government's approach to this, and in particular it's been to embrace the natural capital approach through documents such as the 25-year Environment Plan and the Treasury's Green Book, which is the guidance for public spending, but also some important recent laws such as the Agriculture and the Environment Act, which enshrine these principles. So just quickly, what is this natural capital approach? Well, it's an idea that we've obviously got an endowment from nature in terms of a whole range of capitals which provide a diversity of ecosystem services, but these are only part of the input to the manufacturing process. We of course have human and other types of capital inputting to generate the goods and services that create well-being. These, of course, arise in a whole array of natural units and metrics, and you'll probably be aware there's quite an effort by parts of the community to try and turn these into common units. That's sort of by the by, because what we're really interested in is the fact that after this is appraised and decisions are made, we have impacts on the economy which cycle round and affect that natural capital again. Now, what's interesting is that this model is actually very similar in essence to the circular economy way of viewing how we interact between the environment and human well-being. Again, we've got movements from materials through production, through consumption, energy recovery, landfill, and an awful lot of recycling, reuse, redistribution, remanufacture. And indeed, we can actually see that these approaches are highly compatible with each other, so that it might even be a point at which we can think about an integrated circular economy and natural capital framework, where we take those various capitals and the inputs that they provide and see that they are the basis which underpins production, retail, consumption, and of course, energy reclamation, and with final waste to landfill. But of course, with lots of recycling back up the system through reuse, remanufacture, energy reclamation, and all of these feeding back to the capital restoration, which is vital if we are to have a sustainable economy and society. Now, we're very fortunate today to have leading representatives of three crucial perspectives on this problem. From the Biomimicry Institute, from RAP, and from the Design Council. Our first speaker will be Ellie Banwell. She is a biomimetic scientist and designer at the Biomimicry Institute, which tries to take the lessons provided by nature and use these to provide solutions to mankind's major challenges. We also have Keith James, who's head of policy and insights at RAP. I'm sure you're all very familiar with RAP, whose vision is to generate a thriving world in which climate change is no longer a problem. And we also have Niamh Niamh Crawford, Senior Programme Manager at the Design Council, who leads their delivery of social innovation programmes. Very fortunate to have all these, and I'm going to now hand over to the first of these speakers. I would encourage you to put questions into the chat. Fiona is monitoring that, and we'll feed them back for the question answer session at the end. So I'd like to, with that, conclude the introduction and pass on to our first speaker, Ellie. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you all for being here. Emily, I wonder whether the easiest thing to do might be for you to just move the slide on every 10 or 15 seconds, and then I'll speak according to what's on the screen, and if there's something that I need you to hold, I'll say so. And the first couple of slides actually repeat what Ian has already said in his excellent intro, so you can skip through those even faster if you would like. All right, buckle up. This is going to go quickly. So as Ian has said, biomimicry is the practice of learning from nature to solve problems. Particularly, what we're interested in here is the systems problems, the energy flows, the resource flows. And Emily, I think you can skip on sort of 2 or 3 slides, actually. Yeah, and then on to the next one. Here we go. Right, so back to the previous one. We're good from here. Okay, so this initiative, which is the Design for Decomposition initiative, started when the Loudis Institute asked us, how would the fashion industry look if it functioned as an ecosystem? And so you can take from that it's textiles that we are currently particularly interested in, and the fashion industry in particular. But our immediate answer was, it's too soon to answer that question. We have a bigger problem, and the bigger problem is the fashion industry is behaving as though it doesn't have to follow the laws of physics. And what I mean by that is the second law of thermodynamics says that materials leak, resources leak into the environment, materials disperse, and we can't prevent that. You all know that microfibers are a huge pollution problem. And most of the microfiber shedding happens in the course of an item of clothing's life when you launder it, not through its end of life. I think we can move the slides through a bit faster, Emily. We can keep going a bit faster. That's it. Sorry, if you could go back one, and then every sort of 10 seconds from here, we should be good. And so what you see is that we discard 92 million tons of fashion waste annually. Only 25% of that is collected at the end of its life. Only 1% of that is recycled into new clothing. Everything else is getting downcycled, incinerated, or landfilled. And what that looks like is that picture on the right, with piles of textile waste in cities like Accra in Ghana. And although mechanical and chemical recycling are part of the solution, the laws of physics mean that they can never be 100% of the solution. And we have to deal with the reality that textiles will leak, materials will leak. And so we need to learn from nature to figure out how to make those biocompatible. You can skip that slide as well, and that one. So when I say learn from nature, this is what I mean. You will all be familiar with this pattern. You will have learned it in high school. Primary producers take energy from the sun. They use that to make materials, which are then consumed by primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. At the end of their life, and when they poop, that stuff gets out into the environment, where decomposers close that loop. And what you see in nature is that like for like, that high level recycling of a primary consumer to a primary consumer, yes, it absolutely does happen. Occasionally a predator will eat another predator, but it's comparatively rare. And what nature is doing is recognizing the inevitability of the second law of thermodynamics, and it is embracing the breakdown and leak of materials, and has built resource and energy flows that work with those laws rather than against them. And so what we can do is use that as the map for building a biocompatible fashion system. So can we create fiber crops and biosynthetics that mimic that primary production? Reuse and recycling is absolutely a part of the cycle, but we also need decomposition technologies to truly close the loop. So what we're interested in is everything that's falling out the bottom of the circular economy butterfly diagram. And a lot of you will be thinking, does that mean everything has to compost? And the answer is no, but also yes. This is called design for decomposition, not design for composting. We're not saying that everything should be thrown into the environment where it should break down straight away. If we threw all of our clothes away, even if they were designed to be compostable, we would be swimming in a mound of clothing that nature couldn't keep up with. So we are talking about industrial decomposition, but with the recognition that everything will leak. You can't keep everything within the cycle, and so it must also be compostable. We can have the next slide. And so we're tackling this on a number of fronts. We've got these 3 pilots. We are conducting a large-scale technology review of all of the existing decomposition technologies. We are mapping the waste landscape in a well-resourced context, that's Rotterdam in Europe, obviously, and an under-resourced context, that's Accra in Ghana. And in fact, those two are very relevant because Rotterdam is Europe's largest port. It collects most of the textile waste for Europe and then it ships it overseas. We often believe when we hand our clothing back to a take-back scheme that it's going to be recycled. In fact, the vast, vast majority gets bailed up, packed on container ships and sent to places like Accra, Cantonmanto Market, which is the world's biggest reuse and resale clothing market. And it's directly linked to Rotterdam. Those containers are taking European waste textiles to Accra, where the thriving human capital is upcycling them at a phenomenal rate and doing phenomenal work, but they are being absolutely overwhelmed and with tremendous environmental and social cost. And then the third part of the puzzle is to really deeply understand how decomposition works in nature, so that we can create new tests for decomposition and then use those to design new fibers that don't become the next generation's microfiber pollution bombs. If we can move on. I think we can just skip that. But all it really says is that the long-term vision is if we can create a minimal decomposition cycle, prove that it works in multiple contexts, we can scale this across the entire fashion industry, and from there we can scale it to other industries. So this Design for Decomposition initiative is designed to outlive us all, and it is designed to be globally ambitious on just a scale that absolutely helps me get up in the morning, because the problems we are facing are so big. This is the scale of ambition that we need to start solving these problems. And just very quickly, I'll run through some of our initial results. We've more or less completed the technology landscape. We've more or less completed the 2 waste landscape reviews of the 2 contexts. And Emily, if you can just skip back one slide just briefly, that's it. You can see on the left of this, we have cotton and PET blended clothing coming in. We have a number of different technologies in grey that all join up. On the right, we have biocompatible outputs. And what's important is that each of those orange blobs is some sort of saleable output that helps make this work economically. And this is just one tiny part of a vast technology landscape. And you can skip forward a couple of slides. And another one. So where this fits into net zero is that 80% of the polymers we use or will be using in the future very soon are plastic that came from fossil fuels. Decomposition, literally at its most simple, means break down to carbon dioxide in that context. And so if we just decompose all of that mountain of plastic clothing waste, we will make climate change worse. So you can skip forward again. And so part of what we're doing is understanding the global carbon flows, and then forward another slide, and what controls where in the carbon pool carbon goes based on different levers that you can pull, because we need to not only match the technology to the context in terms of the environment and the community and the money, the finances, the economy, we also need to make sure that we're matching those technologies to the carbon pools, such that we are sending that carbon ideally into the slow carbon pool as a where it is sequestered and not in the atmosphere. This we can skip over. This is just how we are imagining the future tests for biodegradation. And so I think that will do. I think I am double my time and I'd better stop.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Much appreciated. We're now moving on to Keith James, who is Head of Policy and Insights at WRAP. Keith.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So what I really want to do is focus on the immediate opportunities of the circular economy to boost our natural capital and net zero ambitions. If you go on to the next slide, please, Emily. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has really been on a journey over the last 15 years or so. So if you look back to their scientific reports from about 2007, they mentioned consumption, but it was very much focused on energy consumption. By the time we got to 2014, there was a real debate on whether countries should look at their territorial emissions or whether they need to look at their consumption-based emissions as well. And they identified then that actually the way we're consuming goods is actually critical to understanding how we can achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And if we go to this year, the latest report on mitigation of climate change absolutely puts behaviour change and changing the way we use products at the centre of the opportunities. If we go on to the next slide, please. One of the reasons that they do that is because we need actions that are going to lead to immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In the UK, we've been talking about peak emissions being sometime in the past, but for the world, they're still in the future. So over the last 10 years, emissions went up 16%. Globally, they need to peak by 2025 if we're to have any chance of achieving the trajectory which would get to 1.5 degrees. Building things like renewable energy infrastructure is absolutely critical, but we're going to need to do other things in the next 3 years, and that's where everything around the circular economy comes into play. If we go on to the next slide, please. The reason that it's so important is because in the latest reports, the IPCC identified that consumption and exploitation of resources is the strongest driver of CO2 emissions. It's more important than population growth, It's more important than lifting people out of poverty. It's more important than energy generation. To achieve net zero, we're going to need to think beyond energy, because around a quarter of the emissions come from agriculture, forestry and land use, and roughly speaking another quarter come from industry. So some of that is from on-site industrial energy generation use, but some of it's from process emissions as well. So we have to change the way that we're using products. This is also one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, actually. And if you think of most of the environmental issues that the world is facing with respect to planetary boundaries, changing the way we consume and use products is key to reducing the pressure on all of those. If we go on to the next slide, please. And the size of the potential opportunity here is huge. So the estimate in the latest report is that between 40 and 70% of the required reductions in greenhouse gas emissions could be achieved through changing behaviours and adopting circular economy practices to a greater degree. So it does include transport, but it also includes reusing products for as long as possible, recycling more, changing diets and reducing the amount of food that we waste as well. So these are all central, and this really aligns with work that RAP did last year. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Last year we published our net zero strategy. So we identified 8 different measures that anyone can take today that can lead to, well, can support the UK's net zero ambition, but also our global net zero ambition. So we identified 8 actions that could reduce UK greenhouse gas emissions by 500 tons of $500 billion tons of CO2 equivalent between now and 2050. But also, because we trade internationally, they could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent over the same time. And that's why it's so important to think not just what governments can do, but what we as individuals and businesses can do as well. If you go on to the next slide, please. So Ian already shared these in the opening slides, but these are the top actions that we've identified that can contribute towards our net zero target, but also help people to live generally more sustainable lifestyles. We've also produced a little bit of work, because a lot of the time when people talk about the circular economy, my observation is that we talk about it as though it's something for the future, but actually it's already here and it's been here for a long time. So if you go on to the next slide, please. We've published 2 reports recently. So we've done a lot of work over the years looking at the economics of the circular economy in the UK and the EU. And we revisited this last year. So we did some work with Green Alliance in 2015, looking at how a more circular economy can boost jobs, but also then looking at how it could add value. And then we extended that work in 2017 to look at how it affects material flows and greenhouse gas emissions. So what we're able to show is that based on our definition over a 5-year period from 2014 to 2019, the circular economy grew in the UK by about 20%. It's worth, well, it's adding £40 billion a year, so gross value added, but it's also employing about 500,000 people. And it grew in line with the central projection that we made in our work with Green Alliance in 2015. So we think there's a real opportunity actually now, between now and 2030, for the circular economy to double in size. We published a report last week which just highlights actually that this opportunity is across the UK. It can create jobs and value across the UK, and it contributes to so many agendas. It supports not just natural capital, but also the whole discussion around levelling up and the 6 capitals that are identified there. So physical capital, intangible capital, human capital, financial capital, social capital, institutional capital. It contributes to everything. If you're interested in seeing what happens across the UK as well, we've also produced a tool. So if you just mind pressing the button again, please, Emily. Yeah, so there's a tool that we've published which shows the potential not just for jobs, but also reducing our impact on natural capital by reducing our material consumption across the UK by region, and then what that means in potential savings in greenhouse gas emissions as well. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of some of the things that we've been doing. I'm really looking forward to discussing this further in the plenary session. Thank you.
Fabulous stuff, Keith. Thank you very, very much. And finally, I'd like to bring in Niamh Crawford, who is Senior Programme Manager at the Design Council. Niamh.
Thank you so much, Ian, and a tough act to follow, the other two. So thank you so much for inviting me and inviting Design Council to speak today. As Ian mentioned, I'm a senior program manager here at the Design Council, and I work within the Social Innovation Hub, so leading on kind of strategic design advice and kind of service design as opposed to our built environment wing. So just on the next slide there, for anyone that's unfamiliar with Design Council, we are the National Strategic Advisors on Design, and we cover all disciplines of design from architectural to product design, graphic design, print, publishing, fashion, as well as UX design. And we really champion the idea that design shapes the world that we live in, from the places that we visit, from the services that we engage with, the transport we take, the clothes we put on our back, kind of it is all around us in all elements of our lives. However, design is also at the heart of many of the issues that we face today. On the next slide, you'll see our kind of the biggest crisis that we face at the moment, which is what we're all here to talk about, but the climate and biodiversity crisis, which we really feel is the biggest design challenge to date. And the next slide will showcase a couple of stats to really kind of contextualize this. And just in the interest of time, I won't read out all the stats, but from the top two, 80% of the environmental impact of any new product is determined within the design stage. And 60% of the reduction in emissions that are needed by 2035 will require not only a change of behaviour when it comes to consumption, but also to the approach in design from all facets of design. The next slide then gives you kind of where we started when the Design Council was born. It was in 1944, and it was in face of kind of global crisis at the time, which was post-World War, and to rebuild Britain's economy, Britain's infrastructure, and to really build our product industry again. In 2021, the biggest challenge, and still is the climate and biodiversity crisis. And we really want to kind of support our 1.69 million individuals within the design industry to kind of design for the planet and mitigate the emissions that we're putting out into the world within the design stage. So our approach to our mission in order to achieve this is focused on three key components. So on the next slide there, we have our champion and advocacy, our skills and learning, and our transformational programs. So our champion and advocacy includes our advising the government and influencing policy. We also have a Design for Planet Festival, which we run each year, and includes voices globally to talk and address the climate crisis from their own disciplines. And we give a platform to all design disciplines. Our skills and learning is acquired through our Skills and Learning Hub, which will equip designers and non-designers with the tools that they need to design for planet. And it's really important that we make these tools accessible to both designers and non-designers if we have any hope of making any impact, including showcasing best practice and next practice. Lastly, we also have our transformational programs, and this is kind of where I sit. So we have the built environment, and then we also have government, local authorities, and public sector bodies that we work with. And that is really to advise them and meet their objectives through design-led thinking. So where do we start? The next slide kind of showcases, slide after that one, showcases kind of three areas where design is needed. So to design sustainable and resilient places with as much emphasis on adaptation to how our cities are changing with temperature rises, and to mitigate and prevent them from rising above 1.5 degrees, to conserve and regenerate natural resources by being careful about the materials that we use and are designing for, but also kind of to include many reuses and designing in ways that regenerate. So learning from Mother Nature and the best designer of them all, really, which is Mother Nature, but really kind of promoting that circular kind of idea. Finally, the design of products, so services and places that make it easy and attractive to live sustainably, and turning innovation into adoption, and really doing this in an inclusive way. So that's a lot of the work that we do within our Social Innovation Hub. finally, I'll take you through our systemic design framework. So we kind of feel that design needs to change or move on in order to address the complexity of the issues that we face today. Some of the traditional or mainstream design methods just can't quite tackle the problems that we're facing. So we recently launched our systemic design framework, which is on the next slide. And it's a bit of a complex beast, but I'll take you through kind of the three key components. It underpins a lot of the work that we do now because we're kind of targeting more complex challenges. And the figure on the left showcases 4 characteristics, 4 persona types that are needed for a project team to successfully demonstrate systemic design. So you've got a system thinker, you've got a leader and a storyteller, you've got a designer and a creator, and then you've got the connector and convener persona. So that's really essential to have that in a project team right from the start. The 6 principles, which I'll take you through in a little bit more in depth shortly, are what it kind of informs the values and the orientation of the project. And the figure on the right is our ways of working. So it's a framework to really guide best practice and structure the design journey. It's worth mentioning that obviously design happens in multiple different ways with multiple different approaches. So this isn't the only way to design, but as a framework, it brings together kind of key qualities and considerations that we've seen to be particularly important. So in the interest of time, because I know I need to wrap up in like the next minute, I'll take you through the 6 principles, which is kind of on the next slide. Skip over the next slide. There we go. So first one being people and planet centered. So this is focusing on the shared benefits of all living things around us. Next, we have inclusive and welcoming difference. So that's creating safe, shared spaces and language to bring in multiple and marginalized communities. The next one is zooming in and zooming out. So this is really kind of visioning what's present and what looks like a hopeful vision. So going from the micro to the macro. Next one is collaborating and connecting. So really seeing the project as one element of a much wider movement for change. Second last one is testing and growing ideas. So kind of prototyping things to see how they work and allow them to evolve through each kind of soft prototype at the beginning. The earlier you do this, the kind of more you have to work with when you want to evolve it, and to see what new ideas emerge. And lastly, we've got circular and regenerative. So really focusing on existing assets, both physical and social, and how we can reuse, nurture, and grow these assets. So they are the 6 principles. We've recently launched last year our report on Design to Net Zero, which kind of dives into this framework much more deeply. But in the next 3 months, we are developing our skills hub on our Design for Planet and Design Council website, which will set the benchmark for the systemic design framework. It will consist of 20 tools that we feel are kind of most important and most accessible for designers and non-designers to embed systemic design thinking into their projects. And that should be launched in early autumn. We're kind of working towards September for that. And that is it from myself. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Niamh. Thank you very, very much for that. That was grand. Now, what we're going to do now is hand over to everybody in the audience to ask questions. What I'm going to do is, we've got a good number in the chat at the moment, but I'm going to select people to actually unmute and ask their questions to the relevant speaker. I think we're going to start with Catherine Wheatman, actually. So Catherine, would you like to ask your question, but also indicate who you'd prefer to start off responding?
It was more of a comment than a question, and I think I've put about 4 in the chat, so I'm not sure. I think the earliest ones were probably around biodegradable material, and I was responding to Andy Reese's excellent point that focusing on biodegradability sort of allows the misperception that we can carry on pumping just as much through the pipeline, and of course we can't, you know, because a lot of the impacts come from the production itself, not just from the raw materials. And of course, as Ellie pointed out, there's going to be leakage, and the leakage all causes harm. Microfibers come out of washing, and so on and so on. So it feels as if we need to focus much more on how we encourage big brands to move away from these business models that are all based on selling more every year. We need clothes that are more durable, clothes that are suitable to be passed on, to be rented, and so on, and to move away from this fast everything mentality. And I think Amy and Andy and some of the others on the chat have kind of pitched in with comments around that. It just feels to me as if some of the particularly big fashion brands are focusing on new generation materials, so bio this or recycled that, and then telling us that things are going to be more recyclable, or that they're working together on recycling systems. But that's just diverting attention away from the bigger problem. So maybe Ellie might have some views on that.
Thank you very much.
There is a lot to unpack there. And I think certainly fast fashion is something we talk about a lot. And I think it's important to keep in mind, fast fashion exists for a reason, right? And it's not just about profitability, it's also about accessibility and affordability. Apologies for, I will no doubt be slightly misremembering this statistic, and it won't be exactly right, but the take-home message is roughly right. A shirt today costs the same to buy as it did 100 years ago. Not the same adjusted for inflation, the same. It costs £2 today, and it cost £2 100 years ago, but obviously £2 was a lot more money. And so it's important to keep in mind that fast fashion is not just evil. It also enables people who would struggle to clothe themselves to have dignity and feel self-respect. And so it's not enough to just say fast fashion bad. We have to work with the system, we have to work with communities, and we have to work with fast fashion producers, which we are, to find a solution that takes into account all of the challenges. And it's not an easy problem to solve. It's a knotty problem. It has lots of tentacles, and we have to try and tackle them all.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware that we've got a lot of questions now, which is great. So let's try and keep both the questions and the responses fairly concise. I'm now going to ask Andy Rees if he can unmute and ask his question, please.
Hi, and I think it's just been answered really in that discussion. Yeah, so I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Very well, I'll move straight on. Apologies for the formality, but I can't see the full name. It seems to be MT Regent.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely fine.
Mike. Yeah, Mike Regent. Yeah, I was kind of looking at this thing that Andy raised around, product longevity and the ability to then degrade something, and thinking about materials that can be, triggered for decomposition, therefore that they're stable whilst in use. And I guess the thing that struck me, because the question came up, well, what happens with the leakage? And for me, I would be looking to tie this in with something like extended producer responsibility. So, or a different model, a rental model whereby the closed bank or library has the same levels of responsibility. But really it's about that sort of engineering for material stewardship, shall we say? Or design, I should say design, shouldn't I, for material stewardship?
Well, maybe with taking that as a lead, I'm going to bring Niamh in to comment on that. You're on mute, Niamh, sorry.
Sorry, my reception just got a little bit glitchy there. Could you just repeat the last phrase of that question?
Yeah. Can you repeat the last bit of the question, please?
Yes, sorry, it was really about these trigger degradation, so that we're getting materials back at the end of their first useful life, and that then they can be designed in so that we can trigger the degradation to make these more robust in use, but then easier to decompose.
It's a really good question. I think I might not be best placed to answer, because I'm a program manager at Design Council working within our kind of service design sector, but I would encourage you to read, and I'll pop the link in the chat, our Design for Net Zero report, which kind of gives 7 recommendations that are quite tangible to kind of digest, and that might actually be quite relevant to the people that are on the chat that might not have seen it yet, to kind of dive through in a bit more detail. I think that might be a little bit of a longer one to answer on the call, but I'm going to pop it in right here if you guys can see that.
Okay, that's grand. I'm keen to bring Keith in, so I'm going to ask Amy. Could you come and ask your question, which I think I'm going to redirect to Keith.
Well, it might be a few of you kind of involved in this, but I was actually quite glad Ellie covered the concept of carbon reservoirs. I mean, sort of on the topic of this sort of webinar being about net zero and the circular economy link, is we do talk a lot about product flows, material flows through systems. We tend to a bit less on kind of these reservoirs and these timescales of us actually being able to sequester carbon in products. And actually, often we don't necessarily get the right model matched up to the right products. You know, there are some products where we want them to degrade quite quickly in the environment, and Andy flagged some of the things that get littered very frequently, versus those products where actually here's a really good opportunity to keep carbon in a product for a long amount of time. So it's a bit of a question, should in NICER actually almost do that sort of top level view of which products should be long lasting versus which ones, you know, are the real emphasis needs to be biodegradability.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure you can do that from a planned point at the outset. So if we look back over time, you know, do we need an everlasting set top digibox or an everlasting shell suit? The answer is probably no, but at the time when we were launching those products, we might have thought that durability was the most important issue. So there might be some standard things like white goods where you could say that, you know, you're going to want them to last a long time, but they already do. And I think actually the challenge is less about the design and more about the business model. So how can we make it attractive to businesses to remanufacture, reuse, repair, rather than operate on the current model that they do in the linear economy. And a lot of that, I think, is about showing that consumers want that. So a lot of the work that RAP has done over the years is about showing actually there is a consumer appetite for the circular economy. And we've seen businesses like French Connection, for example, trialling rental. We've seen Asda trialling reuse, selling second-hand in store as well. So businesses are prepared to engage with consumers in different ways. We've got to make sure that consumers understand the benefit they're going to get, so they're not going to have wardrobes overflowing with clothes that they never want to wear again. They're not going to have any inconvenience. So it's about how we sell these systems as taking a pain away and making it better for everyone. And again, when we're talking about biodegradability, it's about the system there. So if we're making something biodegradable, we don't want it to end up in landfill where potentially it's going to generate methane. We want to understand how we're going to get it to biodegrade and add value. So a lot of the time when we're thinking about agricultural benefit, we want nitrogen, we want phosphorus, we want potassium. If you've got a biodegradable item that doesn't contain any of those, the question then is, what value are you getting by creating something that's biodegrading and then going into the soil and possibly not giving anything back? So I think there's some really broad and deep questions that could be answered through a NICER centre, but a lot of them are going to be about the design of the system as much as design of the product.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'm now going to ask Oliver Lysell if he could ask his question.
Hi, Ian. This is really a question primarily for you, but anyone else can also chip in. So just really, what are the most promising ways or tools to try and understand some of those natural capital impacts that you highlighted, from changes in products and product systems, but in particular those which are not perhaps very easily linkable to land use change on the upstream side. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for putting me on the spot. I'm going to bring the others in very fast, but what I will say, natural capital decision making and tools are very well advanced with regard to land use. They're not very well advanced with regard to that large majority of the economy that's connected to production, non-land-linked production. I think, and what I was trying to indicate at the start with those introductory slides, I think there's a huge open goal for us all to work together and try and link that natural capital perspective with the circular economy insights into how goods are actually produced and what happens once they leave the shop. Would anybody else like to add to that from the panel? Niamh?
Yeah, I can add in here. We kind of worked on a project with RNIB, the Royal Institute of the Blind, and they were trying to kind of come up with this notion of designing products for those with complex needs, but not having individual products for every individual need, and trying to come up with a product that suits their primary kind of customer, consumer, but also, you know, won't deter kind of a wider kind of pool of customers from buying into it. And I think that's really important in kind of talking about circular and sustainable design, is that it's, again, reducing production and reducing the amount of individual products that one person with multiple complex needs, because people aren't, you know, that linear, might be buying into. And I think it's just, a side note, I worked in fashion for 12 years, and I know exactly the kind of impact that fashion, you know, fast fashion was having kind of on the economy. I was in a tier up, I was in luxury fashion, where we were kind of making to order, but one of the organizations I worked for, we really limited our production runs. So our collections were really scaled down, and we did that so that we weren't left with all of this dead stock, which was a huge financial risk for us, but also was just landing retailers in debt and landfills, you know, in surplus. And how we could kind of engineer that from the supply chain right from the beginning, and actually, you know, design really well-made products that stood the test of time and people didn't feel like they needed more. So I think a huge portion of this is really down to kind of getting the manufacturing right for multiple users, possibly at the beginning, to kind of mitigate the amount that people are buying.
Fabulous insight there, thank you. I'm going to bring in Ling Zhu, who wants to talk about the business appetite to address sustainability. Ling Zhu?
Yeah, I guess my question is quite a fundamental, but probably a little bit naive. Just like the discussion via the chat, there's so many trade-offs. And my question is, like, fundamentally, how we marry up the business fundamental desire for growth, for profitability, and also environmental sustainability, and hence, how can we collectively work together to change and shift the current business model and still have viable economic growth?
I was muted then, sorry. Maybe Keith? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an issue that occupies our minds as RAP a lot, and one of the ways that we work is through voluntary agreements with business. So we have our court-hold voluntary agreement, which is around food. So we're looking to put the UK food system, including imports, on the path to net zero, working with the whole sector to tackle shared problems. And that's really how we see the future is going to be about collaboration. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's so critical. But amongst the things that businesses have signed up there is to help cut household food waste. So they've recognised overconsumption as a key issue, and they're supporting us in helping citizens make more of the food that they're buying. And we're working really closely with them. I think the current political climate, geopolitical climate, is actually a really strong motivator for people to think about consumption and production patterns, where the raw materials are coming from, how they're getting transported around, and actually the business models that we're talking about and the design changes we're talking about are not just about the environment, they're about economic security and economic growth. Thinking about what's happened in the textiles and clothing sector, so many businesses have gone to the wall recently and so many businesses have struggled, where relatively small proportion of their market share is being taken by new entrants. It's a real competitive issue, and it's a competitive advantage if you're offering a more attractive proposition to customers. So if you go online and look for monthly rental subscription services where someone will send you a box of clothes and you send it back and someone else then wears it, so we get more utility out of one piece of clothing, there's lots and lots of them. There's so many consumers are interested in the sorts of things that we hope that they will adopt from a sustainability point of view, but they're adopting because of other motivators. It's about how we plug into those rather than assuming that people have to act because of the issues we care about.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to bring in our own Fiona Charnley. Apologies.
Thanks, Ian. My question is for Niamh, but Keith, you might have a perspective on this and kind of follows on from the previous discussion. I just wondered, what do you think the role of the consumer or citizen is in all of this? And, you know, is it right that we should be placing responsibility on the citizen to do the right thing regarding biodegradability or composting or recycling? Or is this something that we should be designing into the business model and the system from the get-go?
Yeah, so it's something for us to put in, but also we've got to make it attractive. So we've got to take a pain away from somebody's life. We've got to make it easy and convenient for them. So sell the advantage. So with clothing, it's easier. I spoke about overflowing wardrobes and clutter, and that actually people don't want to overconsume. I think that's a fundamental thing. It's not top of their mind. They want to look up to date. They want to go out. They want to socialise. But, you know, on Love Island, the fact that they've been working with eBay on reused items is a great example of actually you can do things in a different way. So it is about the business proposition, but it's also understanding consumers and then giving them something that is going to appeal. Yeah, and profitability. I think the key challenge is that the business models we're talking about have a longer payback period. So how are they going to get financed? How are they going to compete with people who are recovering their costs much quicker in the linear economy? And that is a real fundamental challenge.
Thank you. Ellie, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so for people who didn't notice my chat, I just said, I think companies are starting to wake up to the fact that good business is often, if not usually, better business, especially over the medium to long term. So the higher profitability of engaging with the linear economy is a short-term view. And companies are beginning to recognize that when they take the medium and long-term view, their bottom line is actually served by serving community and environment as well as their bottom line. And so if we can show them that doing good is possible, that it won't tank their bottom line, what we are finding is, you know, that people are crying out for those sorts of solutions. They want them. When they see them, they grab them. So perhaps our job is to demonstrate what's possible, and I do believe that business leaders will follow in large numbers if we can do that.
Absolutely grand. I'm going to begin to wrap it up pretty soon, but Catherine Wheatman said that I thought she was going to ask a question, then she said, oh no, this is just a rant. And I've said, you know, a bit of ranting is not a bad idea. So Catherine, would you like to have a quick rant before I close it up?
I always like to have a quick rant. Was that the one about profitability and
to be honest, there's quite a choice. There's quite a choice from you.
Well, exactly. It was a rant, and I think I was just replying to Ellie's point. I think it is really fundamental that we help businesses understand how they can have a profitable, resilient business strategy that's all about being circular and regenerative, and making the business case, which is what I'm sort of working on now with my next book, helping businesses understand the systemic risks that are facing all of us, which have been exacerbated by what's happening in Ukraine, and how circular and regenerative strategies can be both profitable and require less risk. I'm seeing so many examples, but they're mostly with startups, and it just seems like big businesses are just carrying on, with the super tanker, and can't seem to get off the gravy train of more revenue every quarter and more this and more that. But I think that's the key to it, is finding all the ways to show them that there is a better way that helps them stay in business and make profits.
Fabulous. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Now, I'm afraid we are pretty close to the end of our time here. I wanted to close by thanking Ellie and Keith and Niamh very, very much for some fabulous talks, and for being willing to put themselves in the firing line with the Q&A. For me, this has been a fantastic session, because it actually opened up my eyes to just how much, well, in a way, just how much limitation there is to just the perhaps natural capital view on its own, and what a fertile area is for collaboration across disciplines. I want to just flag up that there is going to be a survey put into the chat. Please do fill that in. It's just 5 minutes feedback, please. You can see Emily's already put it in. If you're interested in signing up to the CE Hub newsletter, please do. Again, Emily will add a link, and please use that also to explore the CE Hub website. Thank you very much for coming to join with us today. I've really enjoyed it. I very much hope that you feel the same. And just in closing, again, thank you very much to Niamh and Ellie and Keith. Really appreciate you coming to give us these fantastic talks today. All the very best, everyone.